Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Monday, April 20th, 2026. I am Eric Feaster, Professional Development Coordinator for the Maryland Department of Health, Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to today's Rate Review Advisory Group. If you would like to use closed captioning so you can read what is being said, click this button. Sometimes the transcription is not exact, but it's pretty close. All attendees are currently in listen-only mode, and your mics and cameras are turned off. Today's presentation is available in the handout section. Click here where you see the paperclip to download the presentation. If you have a question you would like us to read and answer, click here where you see the question mark to add your question. Right. Before our meeting begins, we want to ensure the civility for all meetings. The free expression of diverse viewpoints is a fundamental value of our group. This freedom carries a responsibility to engage respectfully, which means treating one another with dignity and respect and good faith. Uncivil behavior, disruptive conduct, abusive language, threats, or harassment will not be tolerated and may lead to violent speech in the meeting. And now I'd like to hand the meeting over to our Agency Director of Finance, Nicholas DeBoer. Good afternoon, Nick.
Thank you, Eric. If we can go to the next slide, I'd like to welcome everyone. And I'd again like to thank you all for joining us today for our April Rate Review Advisory Group meeting. This is our second meeting of this cycle, and we are looking forward to having some good discussion today. So like Eric mentioned, I'd like everyone to continue to follow the usual steps and rules as we progress. So if you can go to the next slide, please, we'll briefly cover our agenda for today. So today's agenda is going to include a general ledger data briefing and discussion. We will review the representativeness and validation of that GL data, as well as examine GL wage, productivity, and cost component estimates for fiscal year 2025. We'll then open it up for our usual public discussion and public comment period, and then we'll briefly talk about next steps and adjournment. We'll be on a tight schedule today, so we'll be continuing to urge that we move on, and we'll be keeping us on task as we continue, but we'll try to keep as much time at the end for open discussion and public comment. I'll now turn it over to Kristen from the Hilltop team to start getting us into some of the general information.
Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, great, thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Kristen from the Hilltop Institute, and just want to give a quick overview of the data that we received from the provider community for the fiscal 2025 GL templates. And this will be the subset of templates that were used for the analysis that Caleb's going to talk through further today. And so you can see that of the DDA providers, there were 333 who were required to submit templates based on the service data that we collect in the GL templates. As of the end of January, we had received templates from 63% of providers, so 211 had submitted, and we did not get any responses from 122 providers. We took those 211 templates that we received and reviewed them all and shared feedback with providers, and then asked those providers to resubmit based on the feedback given and the discussions had. And so of those 211 that we reached and engaged with, we received templates back from 168 of them. And so this is our subset of the 333 providers that was analyzed, and we'll be sharing more details today. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caleb Levon at Optimus to talk us through.
Thank you. My name is Caleb Levon. So we're going to talk about the representativeness of the general ledger data and talk about how that provider data can be used to construct the rate model. Next slide. And then next slide. So returning to the 168 completed templates that were submitted timely, recognizing there were Many templates submitted after that January date, but that's when we froze the data to start our analysis. Those 168 represented approximately 55% of the overall DDA volume. Now that's true whether you measured the volume by revenue or units or distinct users. They were all within a few percentage points of each other. So slightly more than half of the DDA services. There were slightly more general ledger templates returned from providers in the rest of the state region. 60% versus 50% for the geographic differential. You'll see that we use the abbreviations GEO for geographic differential and ROS for rest of state in the remainder of this presentation, if I forget to use the full term. Although the data was reviewed and resubmitted and was generally complete, there were still some providers in particular who submitted wages but not hours. So they submitted the total wages for their payroll, but for example, but they didn't submit total hours. And so that data in particular couldn't be used for wage rate estimation. It was relatively small, maybe 10% of those who submitted templates were missing hours data. Next slide, please. Here on slide 14, we see that the general ledger data represented all sizes of providers, both big and small. To orient you, the smallest providers on the left and the largest providers on the right, and they're split into quartiles. So the smallest 25% of providers are in quartile 1 on the left, and the largest 25% of providers are in quartile 4 on the right. The three colors of the bars, the three bars represent the three service categories. That's residential, meaningful day, and support services. Overall, the submitted general ledger templates were very representative. The middle 50% of all providers by revenue represented very close to 50% of all the general ledger data. There were obviously slightly more large providers and slightly less small providers, but even the small providers were well representative. So about half of the providers submitted a general ledger, and about 55% of the overall volume of services were covered by providers that submitted general ledgers. A small fraction of those were missing hours in particular, so we couldn't utilize those in the wage estimates, but overall the data was representative, whether we're looking at that by revenue, by region, or provider size. Next slide, please. Now, this is not going to be a complete overview of all the possible rate models, and I realize if you haven't seen this before, this may look a little daunting, but this is how we generate the rate model. So I'm going to give you an overview. When providers are sharing, when they complete their general ledger templates, that is the data that goes into the left-hand table. So this is, as an example, this is just a hypothetical provider, but you see their billable DSP, that's direct service provider wages, 160,000, 10,000 for DSP wages during training, etc. Those are the values that we're pulling off of the general ledger data. And then we use those numbers to calculate those components just to the right of that column in the left-hand table. That is the 6.3% and 12.5%, etc. Those components are then used to construct the rate model on the right-hand side. Now, this is a hypothetical provider, but in practice, we get this data from many providers, and so we have to aggregate it together to try to estimate what a typical provider would see. And so each of these component values are constructed for all of the relevant providers for that service. And we're going to talk about these component values in more detail And there are elements in this rate model that we're not going to talk about today. I'm just going to highlight them very briefly just to say that we will talk about them, just we're not going to be able to get to them today. But elements include the trending the wages forward, what typically you'd call that inflation, but the wage trend we're not going to be talking about today. The service adjustment, that is specifically for facility closures and for one service a no-show. So we are not going to talk about that today. And then the hours per unit and staff per unit components, that is sort of the staffing model for the various services. Residential has a more complicated staffing model. Others have more simple staffing models, but in the end, it boils down to sort of how many hours per unit and how many staff per unit are utilized. So we're not going to get into those details today, but those are all part of the rate model. Then we're not neglecting them. We're just letting you know that we're going to cover those at a later period. The end result of the rate model is that we construct a rate here. It's all the way down on the right-hand side. You'll see billable rate per unit, $15.72 for this very hypothetical model. And we multiply that by the billable hours. In this case, it's 8,000 to get the total revenue that a provider would see at that rate. That'd be $503,000 for this hypothetical provider. And the rate model is constructed so that the revenue from the billable units times the billable rate should cover the expenses. And so you see those two green boxes at the bottom, the total expenses, if you add up the expenses for this provider, and then on the right-hand side, if you multiply the rate times the billable units, you get the revenue, and they should match. That is the goal. That is what we are trying to do. Now, we're trying to do it for the typical provider for services, but overall, we want to make sure that the rate covers all reasonable expenses and that the providers, that their revenue balances out to their expenses. Now, I've shown you sort of this, I've talked about the representativeness and I've shown you a typical kind of rate model, what we're going to do with the data. Let's talk about the specific components, starting with the wage estimate. So next slide, please. Next slide, yes. So the type of rate model that Maryland uses is often called the brick model. And in that, the wages represent the brick of that model. All of those other components that I showed you are relative to the wages. So they are constructed in such a way that when the wages are updated or trended forward each year, the other component costs, which are relative to the wages, are updated as well. So the wages are our starting point, and that's and so that's going to be our focus here. We're going to talk about the wage estimate methodology. The general ledger contains data on the total wages paid to the DSPs and the total hours for those DSPs. From there, you can construct a wage rate simply by dividing the total wages by total hours. So the first step is making sure that for each provider, they have both wages and hours. And I mentioned that we started with 168 providers, but in the end, we used a total of 159 distinct providers at some point in any of these analyses. There were 10 providers and they were missing that weren't used, and it's because generally they didn't have hours data. We also checked for outliers in the wage data. We used the 1.5 times the interquartile range, or IQR. Now, if you're not a statistician, you're probably not familiar with this, but it's a rule of thumb for determining when data is so different from typical data that it should be excluded. You take the distance between the 25th percentile observation and the 75th percentile observation. That's your interquartile range. You multiply that by 1.5, and then you subtract that value from the 25th percentile to get a lower bound, and you add it to the 75th percentile to get an upper bound. And so observations, values outside those bounds are excluded. Now, we applied those limits to the wages and excluded any outliers. We also checked specifically that there was no wages that fell below $15 per hour which was the minimum wage or the lowest minimum wage statewide for the reporting period. So there was a base of $15 an hour, and anything below that was excluded. To get the estimate of the wage, we use the median wage. If you'll remember, the median wage is the 50th percentile. Half of the wage observations were above that and half were below that. It represents a typical provider wage, and using the median is the norm for estimating wages. For example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, uses the median wage when they're reporting wages. The reason that we use the median is that the mean or the average may not be representative if the data has a lot of outliers or it is skewed. And wage data typically does show a pattern that is skewed. It is most often has sort of a clump in the lower area and a long tail on the upper side. And that is because it is cut off on the lower end. In this case, for example, it can't go below the minimum wage of $15 an hour, but there's no equivalent maximum wage. So the data is clustered in some area, but there's room for observations on the high end that are not truncated. So because it ends up skewed, the median ends up being a better measure of what a typical provider is paying. Now, almost all providers provide multiple services. So generally in the data, we're looking at wages and hours. We're looking for specific services or groups of services. We have grouped some services together where we felt not only were the reported wages similar, but also the actions and activities performed by the DSPs are similar. For this analysis, we had 2 residential groupings, 3 meaningful day groupings, and 7 support service groupings. The support services cover a wider array of services. I will also just note that specifically for environmental assessment, there wasn't enough data to use the general ledger, the GL data to accurately estimate environmental assessment wage. So you won't see estimates of environmental assessment from this general ledger data. As we get better and more consistent data for that specific service moving forward, we will revisit that wage estimate. Now, next slide. I wanted to make this a little more concrete when I was talking about outliers and what the data look like. So I'm showing you a specific example of a wage distribution for a service. In this example, it's community development services. And we had a fairly large number of responses for this. And so what you're looking at here is a histogram of the wages. The count is the number of providers at these wages. The wages are across the bottom from $4 an hour to $84 an hour. The 2 different color bars are for the geographic differential region and the rest of state region. So focusing on the geographic differential region, that is the darker bars, the dark blue bars, that lower limit represents the 25th percentile minus 1.5 times the IQR. That's that lower bound. And in this case, it happened to be $9.32 for the data that we received. The upper bound, likewise, is the 75th percentile plus 1.5 times the range, the IQR, between 25th percentile and 75th percentile. In this case, it was $32.69. Now you'll see observations all the way up at $78 and $84 an hour, and you'll see some that are at $6 an hour. So those end up getting excluded by our outlier analysis. You'll see that almost all of the values are clustered there between $16 and $22 in this particular example. There's some higher values, maybe a little bit of extra around $26 to $28 an hour, a few more providers at that higher range, but most are between $16 and $22. And when we take the median for the geographic differential region, it's $20.83 for this specific service. Now this pattern, it varied, but this was a fairly typical pattern when there was that we saw where there was a clustering and a slightly longer tail on the upper end. That was very typical of the wage data that we receive from the general ledgers. Next, we're going to talk about the groupings of these providers into services. So next slide, please. On slide 19, the numbers in the table represent on the upper, you'll see these fractions. The top number represents the providers used in the wage estimate, and the denominator is the number of providers providing that service in the claims data. So, for example, that top row for community living enhanced support, you'll see that for the geographic differential region, it was 1 out of 2. That means 1 out of the 2 providers of that service submitted a general ledger template and was used in the wage analysis. For rest of state, it was 2 out of 4 providers submitted data. Other services obviously have a larger number of providers. Overall, I think it would be fair to say that roughly a third of the providers were used in the final analysis, although that clearly varies by service, and some of these fractions are larger and some are smaller. But among the providers that did respond, as I showed in the wage distribution graph earlier, the data was reasonably consistent and in alignment with other similar services where we were able to compare them. So when we looked at various residential services, they tended to have similar wage distributions. And so we grouped them as shown by this color coding here, showing the various groupings that were done. There was overall strong relative consistency within each of these wage groups, and we were able to use this data to estimate wages. So next slide, please. Moving on to slide 20. There were 3 services that required some specific adjustments. So in the interest of transparency, the general ledger collected data for all behavioral support services together, but within behavioral support services, there are a variety of sub-services, including brief support implementation services, planning, assessment, and consultation. In order to try to estimate the different wages within BSS, within behavioral support services, we made use of the claims data. Specifically, we performed a regression on the claims mix for each provider against their reported wages. We found that the consultation service providers were more highly paid, and that difference was significant. The other services within behavioral support services didn't have a significant wage differential, but for consultation, it was about 70% higher than the others. So in this case, the data wasn't split out in such a way that we could estimate each specific service within behavioral support services directly. So we resorted to using the claims data to try to estimate that using a regression. For nursing support wages, there was a different adjustment was required. Now, it's not a large service. There are about 16 service providers in the geographic differential region for nursing support. And we had 7 respondents in the general ledger data for that region. But there were 4 observations where the respondents had very small total wages, not the wage rate, not the dollars per hour, but the total wages, for example, were less than $1,000 in total wages for the year. So there's, out of the 7 responses, there were 4 that had lower wage totals, and those 4 specifically also had lower wage rates, in the low 20s. And they weren't technically outliers according to the IQR rule, but they were not aligned with the other 3 observations in the geographic differential region, and specifically not aligned with the I forget 13 or 15 observations in the rest of state, which were all reasonably consistent at quite a bit higher level. So we excluded those 4 observations that had those smaller wage totals, and that meant that the remaining 3 observations in the geographic differential brought those wages up into alignment with the rest of state wages for nursing services. Finally, I mentioned previously that there just wasn't sufficient data for environmental assessment to make a wage estimate, so we'll continue to use the existing rate model wages until we can obtain better data. Overall, I will say that the wage estimates were lower than we had assumed in the rate model previously, and that varied by service. However, the productivity factor, which we're going to discuss in more detail in the next section, would bridge most or more than that gap in some cases. Some services were up and some were down relative, but absent the productivity factor, they were lower. The differences in wages between the geographic differential region and the rest of state were small, not enough to definitively support a regional differential. We did our estimates both by region and statewide. There were small different wage differences between them, and it varied by service, but they weren't large or significant. I think that the differences between the regions used to be larger, particularly right at the start of the minimum wage. Over time, I think that gap has shrunk. I will note, just to help people orient, that when you think of rest of state, you should probably mostly think about Baltimore. Baltimore metro area, that is all the counties in the larger Baltimore area, represent about 80% of the service volume contained within the rest of state. And rest of state is about 2/3 of the overall volume for all services, with the geographic differential being about 1/3. Also, the previous model included wage differentials for enhanced services like community living, enhanced support, personal supports, enhanced. There was not evidence that those services were receiving higher wages in the rate model. So that's a specific question to the RAG. Are the DSPs that are providing enhanced support services, are they differentiated from the other service providers? Are they in particular receiving a higher wage? If any of the RAG members would like to respond to that question directly, I would entertain that discussion, particularly about the enhanced support services.
If I actually had Chris, I had a question kind of prior to that.
Yeah.
When you're saying that the GL wage results are materially different from the BLS wages, how materially different are we? If you said it, I missed it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it varied by service, but absent a productivity factor, they are noticeably lower, and it varied by service. Residential services were typically around $20 in the $20 range, for example.
So again, are we talking about, we say materially? Or are we talking a particular percentage? I mean, I'm trying to get down. Are you looking at 10? You're looking at 20%? And the other question I've got is, are we comparing same time periods? Obviously, the state, when we give out funding, it takes the providers a period of time to gear up to that. You don't launch the same day the state budget comes out, and providers obviously in the last 2 years have been very tentative because of the state's budget situation. So just trying to make sure we're comparing apples to apples and we're taking into consideration the timing factor, things moving forward.
Yes.
And then I'm still trying to figure out what you mean by material.
So to answer your first question, the first part of this, the wages that we're looking at are the reported wages for the 2025 period. And obviously, we will take the 2025, the reported period data, and trend it forward to the rate setting period. So if we're talking about 2028 rates, for example, it would get trended forward by 3 years. So in that way, we try to account for this wage growth that happens over time. Materially, as to your question about how different the wages are, we're still looking at that, and we're asking for your feedback for the differences that we're seeing. We are seeing that the wages are lower before we apply the productivity factor. After we apply the productivity factor, some wages are lower and some are higher.
Just kind of a follow up to that. So when we're talking FY25, as a provider, I'm sitting there on July 1st of 24, figuring out what I'm giving out for increases. Are you looking at that date from the BLS wages? Or are you looking at 25, 26? That's what I'm trying to. That's the part I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah. So if we are going to put the reported general ledger wages side by side with the BLS wages, I would use the 2025 GL reported data, which takes place for fiscal 25 from July 1, 24 to June 30th, 25. And I would compare that to the BLS wages for 2024, which are a calendar year, but then you need to trend them forward 6 months. So I would apply an inflation factor. And for that time period, it's about 1.5% for those 6 months to move them into alignment with the reported general ledger wages. Now, regardless of what you're using, then to construct the rate model, we always take whenever the data was reported and trend it forward to the middle of the rate setting period. So we would trend forward to January 1 of 2028, for example, if we're setting the fiscal 28 rates using the reported wages.
I just where I'm headed with that is from a business perspective, I have to make a decision on July 1st of 2024. I'm not necessarily trending throughout the year, so you guys may be trending out in front of the decision-making process. Not that the rates don't, I mean, I got what you're saying about the rates, but again, from a business perspective, to give out increases in staff salaries, I've got to make that decision kind of at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, we understand that. To the question about enhanced supports wages, are any of you familiar or providing those services, and are those wages separated out from non-enhanced support wages? Are those DSPs specifically different? Because we did not observe that in the data, and so I want to check that and make sure that aligns with your expectations.
Caleb, you have a hands up from Laura Howe.
Oh, Laura, please.
Thanks, Steve. So Caleb, just to back up for a second. Well, two things. One, to affirm what Chris is saying. And now we're in our second year of rate cuts. So we have heard from many providers that they have been nervous about giving out. I mean, they've certainly given raises, but they have been nervous in light of rate cuts about trusting that the funding will be there, because once you give a DSP an increase, you can't really take it back. It's very difficult to do. So I just want to say that, and I've gotten an overwhelming amount of feedback about that, and now having a second year of rate cuts has not helped that confidence in the funding actually being there. So that's one. And then the question is whether you, when you look at what is actually, or if you're looking at what is actually in the rate, are you factoring in the percentage of what is actually funded? Because when we look at the BLS wage, it looks, I mean, it's one number, but then when you factor in like 86-87% of funding, it really drops it considerably for some of, for example, for community living group homes. So I wondered if you were looking at that when you're doing the comparison.
So in this case, we're comparing the fully funded rates, and the funding percentages in the end are a policy decision by DDA. Ultimately, I'm trying to determine what is the fair and accurate rate, right? And then layered on top of that, of course, are questions about funding levels and what money is available. So to the extent possible, recognizing everything is linked together here, for the analysis piece, we're looking at the fully funded, fully loaded rates and trying to determine what that fair rate is.
Okay,
So
well,
that's what I'm comparing.
Okay, well, I think that really needs to be very clear, because this presentation is giving the very distinct public impression that providers are not, are falling way below what the rate provides, and that's not what you're comparing. So I think that very much needs to be stated in any presentation that talks about this.
Caleb, Jessica has a question.
Jessica, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to get to your question, I think, about the enhanced, and not that I think that my answer is going to be super helpful, but in the self-directed space, absolutely, I would assume that the wages for people providing enhanced supports are higher. But again, I don't know that you would see that in your data because we didn't collect self-direction data. But I find it interesting if that is the case, that it isn't. I would want to know why, because that often that higher amount should be reflecting the acuity levels of the staff to begin with. At least that's kind of how I would understand it. And or some training. So maybe it doesn't show up right away, but I think you have to kind of look at the reason why somebody would qualify for enhanced and whether that reflects right onto a wage or if it reflects in other components, like program support or training. I would imagine that those would be higher based on their needs. So I just wanted to provide that response, but I do feel like in self-direction, there's certainly a difference in wage information for enhanced.
That's helpful feedback. Thank you, Jessica. For any of the providers in the traditional model, is there feedback from you on a differential between enhanced and not?
We have a hard time here in this room raising our hand. So I don't know how if there's somebody moderating this discussion.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Karen. I saw a hand raised in the room.
That was me. I can do that.
Okay.
Just tell him, stick your hand up.
Okay. Matt's been raising his hand. You want to talk about the?
So the graph or the chart or whatever that you showed a couple slides ago, just so I understand, that was a distribution of each bar represented the number of providers for whom that was the average wage for that particular service. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so for some of those you got like $9 on the lower end, and then you got $40, $70. So we know that they're not doing something illegal and paying people $9 an hour, and we can pretty much assume that no one's paying an average wage of like $70 an hour for day services. But we just trust that the middle ones are all right, the rest of the data, because it just seems to me that like if the calculation is spitting out stuff that can't be right, then we should probably revisit the whole methodology again, rather than just trusting that the outliers are wrong, but the rest of it is accurate, because it just seems like it's closer to what we think it would be. but that's.
Well, thank you for raising that point. The purpose of all data is noisy. This data is not any particularly more noisy than any other data that I've ever analyzed. But there's going to be providers who misunderstand or end up reporting hours from one thing and wages from something else and end up getting confused about it. So there's going to be mistakes in the data. The purpose of the cleaning and validation is to try to eliminate those outliers, determine, we use statistics always. I'm sure you've heard this law of large numbers, or the whole point of taking a median is to find the middle value so that the noise on either end is filtered out. We want to filter out as much noise as possible and get as much signal as possible. And when the data is grouped like that in a consistent way, that gives us some high level of confidence that represents like a true value. Now, each provider is going to be different, so there's going to be variation, but I don't expect that all of those providers have somehow made the same mistake and that the value is essentially different in some meaningful way. That the real value, the real typical value is somewhere meaningfully different. So
Caleb, we've
yeah.
got a hand raised in the room, and then Laura, I see that you have your hand raised.
Okay. Whoever's next, please.
I just think, just to follow up though, if the outliers had a very significant problem that completely threw it off, it doesn't mean that the ones in the middle didn't have a slightly different problem that are trending them lower or even higher. It just seems like I don't know that calculation's working. I don't have confidence in it working if it's not working in those cases, because to your point, the inputs could be wrong. But there's nothing about that graph that made me think I have confidence in the middle numbers. It made me feel like I calculator that, and I started typing in 2 + 2, and I got anywhere from 1 to 7. I would assume the 4s were probably also an accident, not that the calculator worked most of the time with it.
So Matt, the distribution in that slide is very similar to distributions you see around the country when you do DD rate setting.
Steve, can we go back to that slide?
Can we please, Laura is next, and then we'll address any further questions.
Is he facilitating the meeting?
Yes.
Oh, he is?
Yeah.
Okay, so he can see the room.
Thanks, Steve. Can I just ask Caleb, was enhanced broken out for every service that has an enhanced option, for example, personal supports in the GL tool?
Yeah, so in the GL tool, the personal supports were reported together, but when I looked at the providers that did enhanced versus the providers that did not do enhanced, I did not find a difference. Using the claims data, I'm sorry, I left that part out. So using the claims data applied to the respondents from the general ledger, did not find significant differences.
Okay, so you didn't use the GL tool for that.
Well, we did use the GL tool to get the wages that the providers were reporting. Use the claims data to determine which of those providers were doing enhanced and which were not doing enhanced. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you looked at essentially the upper end and didn't see a difference. You're saying.
Yeah.
Caleb, this is Karen Lee here in the room. A couple of questions and comments. First of all, did you do any crosswalking with professionals that have to be credentialed versus professionals that did not have to be credentialed?
When you say crosswalking, do you mean crosswalking to what?
To the wages.
To the wages. So we, okay.
You've done some clumping together of wages that require different skill. So in employment service, your follow along, ongoing, and discovery, the credentialing of the staff is different, and you have put them together. And so you're going to see probably a vast difference in wages, hopefully, because you have put together both credentialed and uncredentialed requirements into one category.
Yeah.
So I believe that for validity, you need to separate out anything that requires a specific credential. So again, in the behavior, there are some of those services that must be done by somebody who is not credentialed, somebody who is credentialed with a national credential, and others that have an academic credential. And they are different service requirements and different credential requirements. And so I would want to see some of that broken out so that we could see a little bit more. And the only reason I say that is last year when we were unsatisfied with what was happening with the follow along and our request to have that looked at, one of the outcomes was that we didn't have the correct data. And by you blending data of people who are credentialed versus people who aren't credentialed, you are watering down, I believe, you are watering down the requirements of the credentialed data or the credentialed staff.
Okay. We'll certainly take that feedback. I will say that we looked for each of these elements, we looked at them individually before clustering, and I totally understand and even agree with the idea that credentialed employees should see higher wages than non-credentialed employees. But as I mentioned, we do not, the data is noisy, but we do not necessarily see that in the data. When providers report their wages, we are not necessarily seeing that DSPs, who we would expect to have higher wages, showing higher wages.
But Caleb, let's take the comment. Let's look at how we can do a finer crosswalk of the data to just make certain that we are addressing that concern and recommendation.
Certainly.
And then I wanted to answer your question about the paying more for advanced services. And I think it's an industry sector issue, which is I think that the hopes were that there was a higher rate of pay for somebody who has greater complexity and providing a more complex service or somebody who has a higher complexity. I think you'll see from national data around this, both through the staff survey, the sustainability survey, as well as some stuff that has come out of the University of Minnesota. I think you'll see that organizations find it difficult to pay two people who are working next to one another a different wage or a wage enhancement. And so for equity in organizations, I think the data does show that we do not actually do differentiated salaries. Sometimes there might be bonuses if somebody is particularly difficult around a specific time, or somebody who is really struggling. I did some of this work in North Dakota, looking at some of their very difficult people with trauma issues. And we found even there that there is generally not a differentiated rate. So if I'm working alongside of, so if I'm a residential provider and I'm working to work with Steve and then somebody has dedicated hours or enhanced hours that also get services there, we tend to not see that the wages are different just because two colleagues working next to each other it's difficult to pay different wages. But I do know that the reimbursement rate does see a differentiation. And the idea was, well, of course, it makes sense that if somebody has more significant support needs, that we would have somebody more credentialed, more experienced, and they would be paid higher. And I don't know that in practice that I've actually seen that happen. Right?
Thank you. That's very helpful feedback, Karen. Before we leave this section, I want to make certain that we acknowledge some of the feedback that we've received. We started with receiving feedback from Laura Howell that the presentation of the data needs to recognize that this does not include the downward adjustment of the funding percentage. So we need to be very upfront about that, and that funding adjustment can be a very significant adjustment and impact the amount that providers pay. Chris Parks, I want to make certain I capture your comment. You had mentioned that the provider community has a built-in lag in how it does its payment. And so we need to recognize that there could be a timing disconnect. I apologize. I believe it was Matt made the comment in the room of concerns about the underlying data. And so we need to acknowledge that concern being raised. Jessica raised a point about the differences between the traditional and the SDS. I want to make certain that I'm going through my list and I'm capturing all of these. And I see that both Chris and Jessica still have their hand up. So I don't know the order. I'm going to go Chris first and then Jessica. I apologize if that's the incorrect order.
Thanks, Steve. Really just a point to make and then a question. So obviously a very complex issue, a lot of information. We're getting about 5 minutes to take a look at it, hear Caleb's presentation, process it, and give you feedback.
Yeah.
Why is and we're back to kind of where we were at one point last year, why was the presentation not sent out early to give us an opportunity to really do our due diligence, dive into this, and have some intelligent questions to ask the team? And I'm not, Steve, I'm not sure I'm directing the question should be directed to you or to DDA or who, but I mean, a lot of information really quick, and 5-minute turnaround on something this complex or feedback is, let's be honest, it's darn near impossible.
So Chris, thank you for that question. And we definitely acknowledge the concern that you are stating here. We will do a better job at getting these things to you in advance of the meeting. We had a number of things that we were trying to tie up. As you know, Sunny Die was just last Monday. We will make certain that you all have this deck, and we'll continue conversations at the next meeting so that you have an opportunity to digest, go back, review, come up with other things for our consideration, and we'll continue the conversation. We do recognize that you did not have advance notice. We typically get the decks out to you all at least a week in advance. And so the next meeting will be tied to these very things that we're discussing today after you've had an opportunity to review, and we've had an opportunity to look into some of your initial feedback. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
I'm just going to jump in. You said I was next. So just jumping back onto the enhanced for a second, and more specifically to personal supports and personal supports enhanced. The way I understood it was that the enhanced was built off of that 75th percentile, whereas the regular personal supports is off of the 50th percentile. And my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that was also meant to incentivize, meaning that 75% of the average people providing that service make this much or above. And I think that that factor of needing to incentivize retention of workers it needs to be there from a person-centered perspective. Obviously, we all know how much more difficult it is for people with complex needs to hire and retain staff, or even have staff, so not just the acuity factor, but also, that retention factor, because it's a lot easier to be dismissive of people that have those complexities or, a lot more work.
Thank you for that. At this point, I think we'll move on to the productivity discussions.
We have
Oh,
one
is
more
there still questions?
Yeah, one more comment.
Oh,
So-
sorry.
Caleb, one of the things I think is really interesting, and this, you might not have this historical information, when you talked about the rest of state versus the geographic differential and the rate of pay. One of the things that we've done in the past when we moved from PPS or FPS to PPS and so on and so forth, and had not just 2 different regions, but we had up to 7 regions. I think we had 6 or 7 regions. There was talk at one time about Montgomery County pulling out altogether because of our much higher minimum wage. And when we started to tear that data up back then, and look at it more by county than by regions, especially now 2 regions, we found a lot of skew in the data. And so the Montgomery County providers, who we have to, by the way, collect this data for our county staff. So you might find that that data has already been pulled out for Montgomery County. I believe Prince George's County also might have to pull it out, so you would have access to that data. I'm sure that they'd be happy to share some of that with you, even though it might be a little different methodology. But I would find it incredibly interesting and important to not look at rest of state, but to look at some of the higher producing counties or the higher funding in the counties. So if you were to pull out, like you said, Baltimore, if you were to pull out Howard, if you were to pull out Anne Arundel, and if you broke it down by county that way, you might find that the geographic differential, I would find it very interesting to look at the salaries across those, to see if the groupings for geographic differentials shouldn't be reviewed, so that we have more and better data to look to see. For instance, I know that the Eastern Shore and Western Maryland used to be one region, but Central Maryland had another region, and then Southern did not have Frederick in it. And so there was some changes around that. So I would think that breaking the data down even greater in terms of the wages would be really good for deciding if the differential is currently the accurate, or it should be divided the way that it currently is.
Helpful feedback. Thank you, Karen. Before we move on to the next section, any other questions or comments, or anything that I missed in acknowledging the feedback that we've received?
Steve, it's David in the room. Caleb, I thought I heard you say, this is some number of slides ago, I just want to confirm that I'm not hearing things. You said that there's a slide in there that talks about the representativeness of the data you've received. And you made 2 comments that suggest that the data are both representative and clean enough for jazz. We also know in the slide prior to that, I'm going on memory, that's a shaky thing, that we've gotten less than 80% response rate at this point. And so at the risk of dredging this back up, have we moved off our steadfastness vis-a-vis the 80% response rate? Or can we say, and sleep with our statistical selves soundly tonight that given we've got representative data, that we are going with what we have, and we're not going to continue to chase, at least for that purpose, this 80% target to use these data to inform rate setting.
So, David, I will address that. We continue to target the 80% participation. That is based on the fact that this is a mandatory report that providers are required to submit. It will improve the quality of the data received. What is very important, though, to provide in the way of background is that we have made no decisions about rate setting with this information. We are in the process of still understanding the GL template data, and that is why we are soliciting feedback from the group on some of these issues, like the reporting on the enhanced services. We see this as the feedback phase and the opportunity for you to help us better understand the data that are submitted.
Thanks, Steve. I guess I'll just sort of respond by way of saying we rather unceremoniously pulled follow-along supports and employment rates because we hadn't reached a data threshold. In the last cycle, we opened that discussion. I continue to be very, very concerned that this 80% is a bit fantastic. And while I certainly agree that it's mandatory, and that seems to me to be a DDA issue with its provider community, if data are representative, then they're representative. So appreciate the ability to make that heard.
I want to make certain the group is comfortable moving on.
If we have an opportunity to review this data a little bit more and give feedback by email, this is fine. But since we didn't really look at it.
Absolutely, Karen,
Okay.
as the Deputy Secretary said, the intent is always, if possible, to provide it in advance. We understand how important your feedback is. That's why we're engaging in this process. And as I said, no decisions have been made. We are seeking to better understand the information that has been submitted.
Steve, this is Matt. Just one quick thing with enhanced. Another thing to consider is that behavioral support services is included in that rate, so you can't bill for it separately. And I can't remember if that's reflected adequately in the other components of the brick. And so if not, I mean, there could be a reason it's not showing up in wages because it's showing up in additional clinical support that there's no remuneration for. So that could be another reason.
Appreciate the feedback. Thank you. Appreciate the feedback from Karen, from Laura, from Jessica. Thank you, Chris.
So productivity has been a specific request of the RAG for a number of years, and we didn't have the data to estimate that until we started to get more consistent general ledger data. Let's go to the transition slide and then the next slide. So the productivity factor captures the non-billable time. We didn't have the data to estimate non-billable time until we started to ask for that in the general ledger. We asked the providers to tell us how much time and money was being spent on these non-billable activities. For all of our analysis, we exclude provider service pairs without both billable and unbillable time. There were a number of providers who had billable time but didn't include any values, numbers, or data for unbillable time, and they were excluded. This way, we're not averaging missing data in. Only providers who gave us estimates of unbillable time were included in the analysis. We broke the unbillable time into 3 categories. Those are the productivity factor, the training time factor, and the transportation time factor. The first is the main one. The productivity factor includes paid time off and any administrative tasks and anything else that's not specifically training or transportation. We separated out training and transportation because we wanted to measure those separately so that we could compare them to previous values, so that we could model them independently so that they could vary across services in a way independent from the other productivity factors. The training time factor obviously captures DSP time that is unbillable due to training activities. Now, the previous model had a training component, but it did not estimate the time and material costs separately and did not collect any actual data. The other advantage is that we can compare these results to what we've done previously, but try to measure them empirically. The transportation time factor, unsurprisingly, captures DSP unbillable time spent transporting clients. Now, that's specifically DSP time, not just anybody, but direct service providers transporting clients. That's what we asked for. Hopefully, that is what is reported in the DSP unbillable time that's calculating the transportation time factor. Now, not all services have a transportation component, so it was estimated for those services, and also why separating it out from other productivity factors made sense. Now, the way these components are calculated is we divide the unbillable by the billable, and that can be either hours or wages. We asked in the general ledger, we asked you to report both. We asked you to report unbillable hours and unbillable wages. I don't know if it's surprising or not, but we found that more providers submitted wage estimates for the unbillable time than the hours estimates. In fact, roughly 3 times more wage observation than hours observations for unbillable time. So we use the unbillable wages for the productivity factor and the training time factor. And although both the wage and the hours estimates were relatively similar to in both of those cases. However, for the transportation time factor, the overall, the results with using the wages ended up low, frankly. And so when we looked at that more carefully, the hours estimates seemed more consistent for those services that had transportation. They were more similar in value, although there were fewer observations. They gave a more consistent and slightly higher, or gave a higher answer. So we did in fact use the hours observations for transportation. So,
Caleb, let's pause here. We have a question in the room.
Sure.
So my question is to the Hilltop team. You spoke to a lot of people over the last couple of years. Just out of curiosity, I don't know if you did any, just kind of guesstimate, you are numbers people, around how many providers or what percentage of providers have a sophisticated enough time and attendance system where they track different codes for training or for documentation or for shadowing or for interview, or if they have more than one code that they use to pay.
So I would say the conversations weren't necessarily around the systems they were using to track, but the data that we were looking for. You know, we had some conversations with providers who were looking for information about how to, you know, do some estimations or allocations based on, you know, how they provide services.
Yeah.
But I do think it was very clear in instructions and what we were looking for, right? That like the paid time goes here, and then we need you to distribute your unpaid time across these different categories. And so this year we transitioned to those drop downs to try to make it very clear what we were looking for. And you know, next year we'll go one step further with the like automated submission and
Right.
some of the data cleaning that, you know, we saw on the Optimist side won't be an issue next year because you won't be able to submit your template unless you get the data in the sections where it has to be. You won't be
Yeah.
able to submit it blank. You won't be able to leave. If you enter, you know, wages, you won't not be able to put the hours in. And so some of those, you know, kind of issues and noise that we were seeing, like we will continue to work to make it more efficient
Yeah.
so that it won't continue to come up.
So we're a larger, more sophisticated organization. We have codes for everything. And somebody is looking over it, but I look, I scan down some codes around some issues where I see plus and minuses just for trending purposes. And why does this guy have 2 staff there? Oh, well, somebody was shadowing with him. No, we use the training code for shadowing. So even in organizations that have sophisticated systems to track this, there is a margin of error. But I'd imagine that smaller organizations that don't use less sophisticated time and attendance and accounting, because we do have a fair number of 40% under 40 staff, that you would probably not have the resources to be able to do some of that tracking at that level, or they may not have systems tracking enough at that level. So I also wonder, is there any throwing out data of organizations that might not have sophisticated tracking that way? And so it is really truly a guesstimate for them about how they're dividing the hours out.
I mean, I think we looked at the quality of the data.
Yeah.
I will say my team started looking at percentages and like how providers were reporting different percentages across the cost categories and going back and asking questions because the data wasn't aligned with where we thought the numbers should be.
Mhm.
Some providers said, oh, you're right, and like made some adjustments, and some providers held strong of, nope, that's where those costs should go.
Okay.
I think, you know, if we wanted to take another step further, like in time allowed, we could look at the, you know, providers would have to start reporting to us like how many staff they had, and we could see if there was any, you know, significant difference in what we're receiving based on provider size.
Yeah.
But I think without collecting a lot more information about the systems being used and how people are tracking things, it would be hard to really accurately answer that question.
Yeah. It's a factor.
Yeah, well, I think it goes to the whole data cleaning process and looking at it
Yeah.
and doing all those checks.
Yeah.
It's something we should think about how we can build into.
Sorry, is there a conversation in the room? It's very quiet.
No, I think that was just wrapping up.
Okay.
Karen comment saying that's something we can explore. I also see Laura has her hand up as well. Caleb, I just wanted to mention that.
Excellent. Go ahead, Laura.
Thanks. Caleb, and if you said this, I apologize. And I know you talked about the transportation issue in particular. Did you, or do you know if you saw much of a difference in terms of productivity with enhanced services?
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, so not so much when broken down at that level. I mean, it depended obviously on the particular component. There wasn't as much variation in the overall. Well, also, you know, I'm going to do an example, and then I'm going to get into the actual productivity estimates by service groupings, and maybe that'd be a better place to address that because I'll be able to point to some specific figures.
Okay, the reason I asked is because my understanding from providers that do a lot of enhanced supports is that they, they have more, for example, documentation time, notes, things like
Yeah.
that, understandably. So that's why I asked. Thanks.
Mhm. Okay, the next, if there's no hands, the next slide is going to make this a little more concrete because you're not going to necessarily know what a productivity factor or what that might be and what that might look like. So I'm going to share an example. This is an example for DayHab, which has both transportation and training, as well as general productivity. This is one of the higher, if not the highest, measure of this time factor. So on the left side with the green is a table showing the productivity factors and various subparts of that. And then below that is sort of a list of all the various unbillable time and how that factors into those productivity factors. So you'll see the productivity factor 1.242, that's like a little less than 25%, meaning that the unbillable time divided by the billable time, in this case, would be 24.2%. The training time factor, 0.058, that's about 5.8% of unbillable time to billable time, 15.8 for transportation, and together collectively that adds up to 1.458. Now, going into that, those estimates are these various pieces. So productivity factor, remember, is paid time off plus administrative. So your paid time off would be your holidays, your vacation, your sick leave, right? That's your paid time off. In this particular example, it amounts to 23 days a year of paid time off. And then the administrative tasks, and that accounts for roughly, the paid time off accounts for roughly 15% of that. And then the administrative tasks of 3.1 hours per week is the other 10% to get to roughly 25% or 1.242. So this is really meant to give you some sense of how time per week or time per year translates into those productivity factor estimates. On just to the right of that table, you'll see percent of unbillable. That gives you some idea of what percentage of the total unbillable time each of those activities correspond to. And then percent of year is out of the available hours per year. Here we're assuming a full-time equivalent of 2,080 hours per year. So for example, training here is 82.5 hours per year. Now that's an empirical estimate. We'll talk about training in more detail. We'll talk about each of these components in more detail later, but this is meant to give you some sense of the size and scale of these. So 82.5 hours of training per year would be equivalent to just under 6% training time factor. Transportation of 4 hours and 20 minutes, 4.33 hours per week, 4 hours and 20 minutes of transportation a week is just under 16% transportation time factor. So all of those are added together, that 1.458, if you'll remember all the way back to slide 15 or 16 where we showed you that table, that total time factor is what's multiplied by the wage to get the adjusted wage, and thus accounts for time spent on activities that are not billable. Overall, in this example, the total unbillable time is 653 hours per year. That equates to 5.5 hours billable hours per day for this example.
Caleb, can you hold for a second? Laura, I apologize. I missed your hand up. Did not mean to leave you waiting.
Sorry, that was the old question. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. Thanks, Laura. On the right side, under figure 1, I've put the rate model formula. Normally we show you that table where we build up the rate as a series of calculations, element by element. But here's like the overall equation, just so you have it here, but also specifically to highlight that the time, the the time factors, productivity, training, and transportation time factors are in one element of the equation or one part of the equation, and the material components, the cost components, that is the employee-related expenses, facility, program support, training material, and transportation material are in another part. And you can add the training time and the training material together to get a total training component, and it's approximately the same. If you have 6% training time and 2% training materials, it's roughly 8% of the total, but it is not exactly the same. That is an approximation. Just wanted to show that those parts are in different parts of the overall equation in order to get that, the numbers to all balance out perfectly in the end. If you want to get it exact, you have to separate out those two pieces, and they're treated differently. So that's why it's structured. That's why we have training time and training materials, as to previously we just had a training component and a transportation component because we did not have a productivity component to account for it. So, all right. So now let's look at some of our findings. And next slide, please. So, residential and support services other than behavioral support services had very similar productivity estimates, and employment services and behavioral support services also had similar but larger productivity factors. And those productivity factors imply about roughly 500 hours of unbillable time, excluding training and transportation. The factors that contributed in the data that we looked at was paid time off was a large part, administrative tasks, and for those services that had transportation, that was a large portion of the total time factor. As I said before, we used the hours-based estimate for transportation time. That reduced the observations, but I think we got that data was more consistent and more representative. Respite day was included in the residential productivity group just because those services are provided in a semi-residential service location, in the sense that they're provided in a similar way to other residential services. In the end, it ended up not actually having much impact, as you'll see in the analyses of those two productivities. But just to let you know that we did move that over. Nursing support services specifically did not had very limited productivity data. Those providers didn't report a lot of unbillable time that we could use. And we'll discuss more on the training requirements when we get there, but you'll see that there's additional discussion to be had on the training time. So let's look at the actual numbers on the next slide for productivity. So we grouped the services into 5 broad categories. The lowest was for support services at 1.14, and the high was 1.34 for behavioral support services. Now remember, this accounts for generally for paid time off and for administrative tasks. It doesn't include training or transportation. And then meaningful day minus employment services was somewhere in between those two sets. The lower numbers would correspond to relatively small amounts of administrative tasks, while the larger numbers would correspond to significant amounts of administrative tasks, assuming that the paid time off is relatively similar across all services. That is an assumption, but based on the data that we saw, that seemed reasonable, that there wasn't a lot of variation in the amount of paid time off employees received. So this is the productivity. And let's now look at the training time factors, which go ahead. Sorry, was there a question in the room?
Yeah, you can finish your sentence and your thought. I just wanted to pause before you moved on because we had a hand in the room.
Sure. The last, I just wanted to point out that I included the approximate annual hours there that these productivities correspond to. In order to get those hours, you have to multiply that factor times the billable hours, and it's different for each of these services. That's why the math may seem a little off. It's because you multiply the productivity times the billable hours to get the approximate annual hours for that productivity estimate. But between 250 and 520 hours roughly. Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
Last year, when we were attempting to get more clarity around employment services, and one of the data points that we brought forward multiple times was the role in job development and discovery around indirect time, and how that ratio needed to be looked at. And we didn't have the data available to us, but it seems to me as though if you were to break down employment services farther than just employment services, that we may actually find that missing data that we've all been searching for, to be able to demonstrate that different services in employment services have a higher productivity or unbillable time. So whether we do it now or we save it when we have an opportunity to go back to employment services, I think that that's a really important distinction for us.
Just real quickly, Karen, when you say that, do you have any particular things that you want us to drill down into? Because I think we should take the opportunity while we're looking at all of these things right now to start, start those efforts to go down those avenues.
I think in a crescendo, I would say that the follow along probably has, or the ongoing probably has the least amount of productivity time. Follow along would be next, would have more of it. Then I would say discovery has even more, and then ultimately job development would have the most. And if you started to break those down, that you would find that the amount of indirect time or administrative time increases significantly in a crescendo that way. And it also represents, again, the credentialing that goes along with it. There's definitely a crosswalk with those services and the credentialing and the amount of administrative overhead and overtime, or indirect versus direct.
Very helpful, something we can start looking into.
And the comment, Karen, about sloping is very helpful. We appreciate that insight.
All right, training
just ask
time. Oh, sorry.
Quick question. I'm sorry. Do we have any sense of whether including respite in residential would substantially impact the residential number?
No, as I said, we included it there because noted that there was a similar service location or service type, but in the end, it was a relatively small part, and the two groups had fairly similar numbers, and so it wasn't any significant impact.
Laura, that's good
Okay.
feedback. We can pull some information to show what the impact of that might have been. Appreciate
Okay.
you pointing that out.
Thanks. Just because respite has two different setting types, one is, in a residential, in a community living residential setting, but a lot is in a someone's home or their own home or a neighbor, so it just seems like it would be different. But if it was a small amount, then it sounds like it's not a big deal.
Yeah. So training time, next slide please. Just noting the time here, so I'm going to move us along a little bit faster, but here are the reported empirical results from the training time estimates. You know, previous estimates for the for the training component were modeled on required training, and they incorporated assumptions about turnover. Here you can see that the equivalent estimated hours of training based on the data at a low of, and it's broken down by lots of different services here to highlight this. A low of 17 hours and a high of 82.8 hours. You know, complicating this, generally speaking, as you're aware, workers require a lot more training hours initially, but significantly less in the following years. And that's estimated by the turnover. So, you know, if you retain staff, you're going to have less training hours because you're going to have to do less of that initial training compared to, you know, a provider who turns over staff frequently is going to have higher training requirements. But overall, there was a lot of variation in these values, even for services that might be expected to have similar training requirements. We wanted to share these data so you saw what was reported, and we can consider them. We recognize that they're not necessarily in alignment with the current required training. That said, the overall estimate of training would require some consideration about what the turnover rate is. So that's the training time factors. And if there's no specific questions on that, I'll go to the transportation.
I think, again, this is Karen in the room. Again, because there's a different credential and a different amount of hours in training required by for the job development versus ongoing supports, it might be worth the time to pull that out, since they are the ongoing might be skewing the job development one, because that is a required training. It doesn't really, I mean, of course, impacted by turnover as well, but there is a base training requirement and ongoing CEU requirements for job development.
So I don't want to open any can of worms, but so the, you know, the ongoing job supports and job development, you know, reported 73 annual training hours, and the follow along job supports reported 42. That's just the data that as reported. Does that, so how does that comport with your
ongoing and follow along require the same credential, and job development requires a different credential and a different training requirement.
Okay.
So that's when I said crosswalk, that's the kind of crosswalk that I was suggesting, is that you take a look at the services that have it as well. You have here housing support services also has a credential required training. So just to note where there is other than the basic training, where there is mandated kind of above the line, you might just want to pull those out.
Yeah. All right. Transportation time factor on the next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Is there there's a hand up?
Just about to say we have another hand that just went up. Jessica, go ahead.
Really quickly on the previous slide for training, I was just curious, how are these 13 groups selected, and why wouldn't there have been personal supports enhanced kind of drawn out from just having personal supports there?
Yeah, these correspond to how the data was collected. You know, there's obviously a tension between, we would love to have all of this data separated out into each individual service. That would be ideal. Providers have indicated that that can be difficult, and so a lot of times these services are grouped together for reporting, at least in this 25 GL. And so personal supports was not broken out into personal supports and personal supports enhanced, for example. Now, there are approaches I can take to try to drill down by using the claims data to try to estimate which providers were providing which specific services, and if they were providing a mix, what that relative mix was. But that's an estimate placed on top of the data as reported. It's not, the data wasn't reported in that way at that level of detail. So
Okay, and
so
there's one more quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, one more quick follow-up. So just
Mhm.
assuming that maybe multiple services are provided by essentially the same DSP, how was there a way to capture what category that falls into? Like if if you're taking a training or if you're getting a credential for a very specific thing for someone, like a seizure training or something like that, how are they? How are you making how are you categorizing it, and like what category are you putting it in? Or are you just basing that on what they put it in for the GL template?
Yes, ultimately the starting point is whatever category they put it in. So they were asked, providers were asked to report their data by each of these service tabs, if you'll recall back to that general ledger, and which were groups of services. And so all of the training time for those groups of services were reported on this single tab collectively together. And they were asked to, if for example, DSP was doing two different things, community development and DayHab, the providers were asked to separate out those hours onto those two different tabs. And this gets at that tension of like, the more detailed the rates, the more precise we try to measure the rates or make the rates, then the more detailed and precise we need data. So,
Caleb, I'm going to jump in here. I'm just keeping track of the time. We have some additional slides that we need to get to.
Yeah, let's thank you, Jessica, for that question. And let's jump into transportation. And next slide, please. Okay, so there were 6 groupings here. There's services where there's no expected transportation, and so we did not calculate a transportation time factor. There's also the direct cost for transportation, things like gas and insurance, car lease, that ends up being a larger fraction. The material costs end up being a larger fraction compared to the time costs compared to, say, training. They're almost 50-50 or something like that. So this factor, what I'm showing you here, only captures the time DSP spent driving clients around. And for DayHab employment services, around 200 hours a year, residential services, a little over 100 hours per year. Career exploration had very small numbers. I don't know if that's matches your expectations, but that's what was reported for career explorations. And then, personal support's also similar to DayHab and employment services, about 200, a little over 200 hours per year. And that's somewhere between 4 and 5 hours a week. So that's transportation.
Caleb, can I just ask a quick question? So
Yep.
this is for every employee, every DSP in the service?
Yeah, so this
FTE?
Yes, this is, well, for the DSP. So now this is a bit of a nuance, but if, for example, you have someone who is full-time, is not a DSP, but is basically drives people around to services, they should be reported in administrative costs if they are not a DSP transporting clients. So it may be that not all providers split that out or made that distinction, but that is how this is, because this is meant to capture unbillable time for DSPs. And so if they spend their time driving people around, then they can't bill that. But if it is someone who is not a DSP driving people around, then that would be under administrative expenses. Well, no, I'm sorry, not administrative expenses. That would be under transportation material costs. Sorry, correcting myself midstream here. But that would be under the material costs of transportation. Their wages would be under that component.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm really trying to understand exactly what this chart is telling me. So do you mind just one more time?
Okay. Yeah, so it's saying that compared to the billable time for DSPs, they use between 7% and 10% unbillable time transporting clients, and that equates to well, 7% would be about 120 hours per year, and then the 15 or 16% would be about 200, 220 hours per year of time spent driving clients around. And so we would make an adjustment to the wage to account for this time where DSPs are transporting clients and not billing.
So can I take a stab at this? So CMS does not allow you to start billing for somebody during travel time for any sort of meaningful day service. So for career, community, day hab, employment services, you are not allowed to count travel time as the service hours. And so what this calculates, and maybe Christy, you know, and I don't, because I know that there's nobody tracking this in our organization other than when we start billing for direct versus indirect, and then we would have to take a calculation to subtract. That's a pretty sophisticated. So I think, Laura, your question is a good question that I would find it like residential services, transportation isn't included services all the time, whereas it can't be included for career, community development, day hab as a direct service unless it happens during the middle of the day and you're moving around in the middle of the day, and then it can count. But to and from, just like you and I can't bill to and from on our mileage to and from our offices, but we can, if we're doing mileage during the day, we can. That's the CMS, but I don't know if that's how providers saw this.
So those were the conversations that we had with providers.
Yeah,
for sure. And there's, you know, you can imagine the spectrum of being able to track that and
yes,
understand that nuance.
yes,
Yeah, really, a spectrum of those understanding.
yes.
One, the CMS requirement, how it's being implemented, and then how it's being.
Yeah, I would think that might be worthy of a training on the program side, not just on the finance side for something like this.
Yes, there were some providers who did not understand that.
Yes,
you can't bill that time.
that's right.
They're like, we have all billable time.
Well, from the minute I see somebody,
yeah,
unless you're training them on a van, or if you're training them, then you can do it if it's active support, but a ride is not. Yeah.
So Karen, am I also hearing just another way that DDA can help provide technical assistance for providers? In addition to Hilltop's comments, DDA actually provides some training around the CMS requirement and how it should be.
Yeah, I would think with the what's happening 9 miles down from my office on Capitol Hill and the discussions of waste, fraud, and abuse, this would be a vulnerability.
Get out of my head.
Yeah. You probably think more about that than I do, but
Keeps me up at night.
yeah, I'm sure.
I just said two things. One, in that vein, there was a document produced by DDA years ago that showed like a bunch of different scenarios for transportation, like when it starts.
You know what we call that?
What?
The Michael Chapman document,
No,
the Michael
it was
Chapman
post that.
memo.
It was only like 5.
Okay, because there was a Michael Chapman memo that people call and say, Karen, do you have that Michael Chapman
No,
memo?
which, right, so this said pictures and little icons.
Yeah.
Of the day, and gave all the permutations of like where you pick them up and grading and all that stuff. But anyway, it's very helpful.
Yeah.
I occasionally get the question and send it to other providers.
Yeah, maybe it's one
So
Stacy
good news,
did.
you might already have it.
Yeah.
No, but opportunity now, especially during this cycle and all of the critical things that are in flux, not only from our program implementation standpoint, but as I was just saying with Karen, the main thing that keeps me up at night is the activity also happening at the federal level. We'll
Yeah.
take this back for a future training opportunity. I want to be very checking out the time here, and we still have some stuff. Oh, sure.
Just real quickly, TE as reported by the providers, or was that calculated from the number of hours divided by some factor?
This is calculated from what they reported. They either reported unbillable hours for transportation or unbillable wages spent for DSPs providing transportation. So this is calculated. This isn't a model. This is an empirical estimate.
Okay, because some of them seem low on the other chart, and I was wondering if it's because if you're doing it by FTE, particularly in community living, there's a lot of overtime, and so you have more hours. But if you're counting FTE like 30 or 40 hours, it's a different factor. I throw it off because I was a little surprised by the process.
Appreciate the feedback. Laura, do you have a comment?
I do, thanks. I just think probably a lot of us want to have a better understanding of what some of the data are showing and how you got there. Maybe there could be some kind of in between meeting DDA might consider for those of us who want to do a deeper dive and really understand. I know we're on time constraint, but it's a lot coming at us, and it's all pretty important. So just wanted to suggest that. Thanks.
Great. Appreciate the feedback. Very helpful. Caleb, you have 3 slides on components. Before we jump to those, anything to wrap up in the room? Deputy Secretary Alice?
No, I think we're good to keep moving. Keep moving.
All right, so Caleb, the 3 slides, let's try to go through these quickly so that we can allow time for open discussion and public comment.
Certainly. So next slide, please. And then after the transition, next slide. So all the cost components except general and administrative are calculated relative to total DSP wages, not billable wages. Then when the rate model is constructed, those components will be multiplied by the adjusted wage, not the actual wage. General and administrative is defined slightly differently. It is a percent relative to total cost, not total wages. That's just a legacy definition carried over from other rate setting practices. The 6 cost components are employee-related expenses, abbreviated ERE, facility costs, program support, training material, transportation material, and general and administrative. We had to clean and validate this data. As you've heard, there can be some complexity. Costs that were clearly in the incorrect sections were reclassified. Non-allowable costs were excluded. Any service provider pairs that were missing wage data or had wage outliers or their component outliers were also excluded. For employee-related expenses and general and administrative, we estimated a single statewide value, and that is consistent with how that's been modeled previously. We don't expect that those costs have significant variation across providers, sort of regardless of the service mix. Next slide, please. For each of the other For each of the other four components, the appropriate groupings were determined. The facility component was calculated only for those services where appropriate, specifically DAHAB and career exploration facility base. There was a lot of facility costs reported, presumably maybe for residences or other facilities, but only DAHAB and career exploration facility base should have facility costs. That's how it's been previously modeled. Those are based on the service definitions for those services. Training and transportation were separated into the time component and the material component. We've discussed that in some detail. Transportation material component was only calculated for those services that had a transportation component. Okay, so that's how we did the cost components. And then next slide, we'll talk about some observations. I mentioned that there was a significant number of services that where facility or transportation was not part of the service definition that did have those costs. So some concern there. I think that will improve as providers have exposure to the general ledger and the general ledger template, as that iterates into a web-based platform. And I think that the data overall, we expect that will improve over time. But we did see costs in some services. Program support showed significant variation between services. And that may or may not be warranted depending on the particular service, but there was a large variation in the program support percentages. Finally, employee-related expenses and general and administrative expenses were very consistent and showed the least variation. Employee-related expenses was slightly less than we had previously estimated, and general and administrative was slightly more, but overall, they were very similar to what we had previously modeled. So that was obviously a whirlwind tour of the cost components, but I will now turn this discussion over to Nick for open discussion and public comment.
Thank you very much, Caleb. Thank you for walking through everything. And I want to thank everyone again for all of their thoughtful comments, all of the great feedback we've received, the points of clarification, and the continued discussion. Before we move on to public comment, does anyone or any member have any walk-on items they'd like to discuss? Pause for a moment to let anyone gather their thoughts, see if anyone has anything in the group.
One thing I would really love to see is the data that Caleb is coming up with next to what you're currently using, just so we can see how it fared. I mean, I know that we are in our first round of rebasing, and we're really working on cleaning up the data stuff. So I think that would be really interesting to see how close we really are. Just to see if there, for me, I always look at trending, and if some number looks really off, I would say, oh, we better look deeper in it. So if we could see them next to each other, then I think that would tell us if there's a need for us to look deeper somewhere.
Is there, I should probably know this, and I'm sorry that I don't. Is there a reason? Strike that. Could we get materials and information in advance of our next meeting?
Yes,
Something more than 5 minutes?
I'll include in my wrap up.
Thank you.
It's just exciting to finally have this data, I would say. Thank you to the Hilltop team who's been, I know, on the phone with lots of people for a long time and cleaning this up and training. And you're probably training some people who've never had any experience with a lot of this or know the rules or anything, so I appreciate your time on this.
There is nothing else from the group. We do have a moment maybe for a few, we have a few minutes remaining for any member of the public who'd like to chime in. And for any comments and questions that, that I see in chat, we'll be sure to save those and record those, and we'll revisit those in the next meeting or maybe individually in email, depending on the nature of the question or follow-up. But we can leave it open for maybe 2 or 3 or a handful of public comments, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah. Okay, so I saw Jessica's hand go up first. I think this is keeping it.
All right. Before the public comment, I just want to jump in really quickly. I put something in the chat too. So I'm a couple of things. Is there a way to get like contact information or email information of the members of the RRAG to be able to communicate? I'm new, so I maybe don't know that. I was a little bit thrown off by not having any information up until the moment we logged on here. So I feel very underprepared for discussion. I was curious to see, in addition to that, the email that came out about the location of the meeting. I don't know if that just happened for me, but it came out just a few hours ago. So it was frustrating. I think it's a lot easier to communicate in person. So I would have liked to have been there. So I'm trying to gauge how well this group communicates. I think starting off with maybe some emails of some people, because I can't tell if it's just because I'm new and don't know, or if it was just, we lacked a whole bunch of information to be prepared for today.
The latter.
And then second, is there any kind of underlying data besides the slide deck of observations that will be provided?
So Jessica, what I'll say, and my team can answer the second question. The Rate Review Advisory Group has been meeting with its provider members for numerous years now. Typically what happens is the materials are sent out in advance of the meeting to give the membership an opportunity to review the materials and have healthy discussion with us. As I said earlier in the beginning of the meeting, this time we were delayed in getting those meeting materials out, and we will be following up with the membership with the materials and an opportunity for you all to read them, digest them, and come back for additional collaborative conversation. I'll provide additional updates during my closing remarks, but just wanted to let you know that this group has been meeting for a long time. We do define the meeting cadence. We share the membership information as well as where the meeting location will be, either hybrid or in person. We too agree that we like an in-person engagement, but we offer the opportunity for it to be a hybrid platform. I'm going to turn over to Nick to answer the second question.
Yeah, and that was in regards to the data. So we are still kind of working through that data, and I think that this kind of almost ties along with Karen's feedback and piece about having some of that data up side by side so that we can compare that and see that comparison. I think we'll continue to discuss this and see how we can share this data in a way that whether via the meeting or via handout, whatever way is most appropriate, that'll allow everyone to be able to digest it without it confusing if we just give kind of sheets of GL data that's been kind of collated and regurgitated out on the other side. So I do think that that this is all really helpful feedback about presenting the data and how we can present the data. And we'll definitely be giving some more numbers and some more information in the following days or following meetings. So I appreciate that feedback. We are pretty much at time, so I do see Karen and Mimi, you both have your hands up. If you could put your questions in the chat, I'll be sure to stay in here until we get those or any feedback, and we'll continue to We'll either revisit them when we next adjourn, or we can follow up independently if it's something that doesn't require a larger discussion. I would like to move it on to the next steps here. If we can progress the slide, thank you, and you can go to the next one. So the meeting invite for the next RAG meeting will be sent out to all registered attendees. Meeting materials will be made available following the meeting. If you have any questions regarding registration or you'd like to request accommodations, please contact Mary Jane Osazawa at maryjane.osazawa@maryland.gov. And I don't believe that's included on here, but we'll include that in any email communications that go out. But we'll see the RAG group next, for the next official meeting on Thursday, May 28th. And the next slide will have, show the link and show the website where you can find any rate review advisory group materials. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to the Deputy Secretary to close us out and to adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, RAG members, as well as the public, for joining us today. We really appreciate the feedback that you were able to provide during today's discussion. However, it is not lost on me that it is critical for you all to get materials in advance of the meeting, to have opportunity for us to have this collaborative conversation. As Nick noted, the next meeting is May 28th, but we are going to call an ad hoc meeting the week of May 4th. Please be on the lookout for a meeting request there. We may even do a doodle poll to the membership just to make certain that we can get as many members possible to that meeting. The purpose of that meeting will be for you all to speak to your comments, feedback, and so forth, any additional comments and feedback based on this week's slide deck, and to prepare for the May 28th meeting. I want to thank you all again for coming together with us today. We really appreciate your partnership. This is a critical process, very important to the department, and we look forward to our future discussions. Take care all.